Okay, here's our video on comparing radicals. And remember, radicals are square root. And let's go over some terminology. So remember, square roots are radicals, and that's a square root sign. Okay, so that's a square root sign. And remember when we had an integer times a radical, let's say we had 3, and we had a radical, let's say 8, whatever. So it's 3 times square root of 8. Now what you don't want you to do, and we'll do this with cube roots, is if the 3 is there, that means that's a cube root. This is a cube root, so you want the number to be bigger and not inside this square root symbol. But we'll go over that with cube roots. Okay, so remember we had, from the last video, we had the coefficient, which was outside, just like with linear equations, and the radicand is the number inside the square root. So that's the terminology. Okay, and as we remember, a radical is a square root, and roots are radicals, so remember that. Now, we need to know that roots are the opposite operation of exponents. Okay, so here we have, again, the opposite operation. 3 squared with the exponent is 9, and the square root of 9 is 3. So that means that's why they're the opposite operation. So when you undo a power, you're doing a square root. So if I said 4 squared, we know 4 squared is 16. If I say undo the power, well, the square root of 16 gives us 4. Okay, so let's compare a square root to the nearest integer. Let's say I had the square root of 4. Well, we know the square root of 4 is 2, so that's the integer. That is the integer. But if I had the square root of 3, what's the closest integer? What do you think? The square root of 3. Well, the square root of 3, so we have the square root of 3 up here. And that's, now we know the square root of 2 or the square root of 4. What's it closest to? The square root of 3 or the square root of 2 or the square root of 4? The square root of 4 is 2. And the square root of 2, we said, is an irrational number. So the closest integer is the square root of 4, which would be 2. Okay, let's do another one. To the nearest integer, let's say we had the square root of 12. The nearest integer. So we have the square root of 11, that's irrational. Bring that over. And the square root of 13 is irrational. So we're not getting an integer. So we need to know a perfect square to give us an integer. So the first, we have the square root of 9 over here. That's 3. And the square root of 16 over here is 4. So what's it closest to? Is it closer to 9 or is it closer to 16? Well, it's 4 away from 16, but only 3 away from the square root of 9. So the nearest integer would be the square root of 9, which would be, and the nearest integer is 3. So that's to the nearest integer. Now, what is greater? Let's do what is greater. What is greater? Well, obviously, if I gave you the square root of 9 or the square root of 11, we know the square root of 11 is greater, just like with integers. But let's say I had the square root of 11, or let's say I had 4.6. Which one is greater? See if you can do that. Well, so the square root of 11 is between, remember, it's between the square root of 9, which is 3. We want the nearest integer, bring that over a little, and the square root of 16, which is 4. And it's much closer to the square root of 9. So it's approximately, the square root of 11 is approximately probably 3.4. So we know 4.6 is much greater. Let's do a few more. Let's say we had the square root of 55. Square root of 55, bring that over. Or let's say 7.3. Try that. Which one is greater? What is the square root of 55 between? So we have the square root of 49. That's 7. And the square root of 64 is 8. So that's what it's between. And what is it closer to? closer to the square root of 49. So it's 6 away from that, but it's 9 away from there. So it's closer to 49. So it's about, here's what you get, it could be 7.3. Or maybe 7.4. So if you square 7.3 squared and 7.4 squared, you'll know what it's closest to. Bring that up. What'd you get? So if you did 7.3 squared, bring that over, you would get about 53.29. So 7.3 squared is not near 55. And 7.4 squared is about 54.76. So we know that the square root of 55 is greater. So that's how you find out which one is greater. All right, let's do one more. Let's say I had 6 square root of 12, or we had maybe 5 square root of 16. Which one is greater? Try that. Okay, well, with the square root of 12 we can break down, remember, to the square root of 4 and the square root of 3. And we know we can't touch the square root of 3, but the square root of 4 is 2. And remember, we had that 6. 6 times 2 is 12. So this is what we're left with that answer. Now, what about this one? Well, the square root of 16 is 4. 5 times 4 is 20. So the greatest one is this one. Okay, that's how we do comparing radicals, and we'll do cube roots next. Great job.